He spat on her in front of everyone, but what he didn't know would destroy him. The Dawson mansion shimmered that night, chandeliers glowing, silverware polished like mirrors, laughter echoing across the marble hall. Everyone looked perfect, dressed in elegance that smelled of money and superiority. Emma sat quietly at the far end of the table, her deep brown skin glowing under the crystal light, her black curls pinned neatly. She smiled politely, even though every word tossed around the table sliced at her dignity. This was her husband's world, and tonight it would show its true face. Richard Dawson leaned back in his chair, a glass of wine in hand, his blue eyes gleaming with arrogance. "Emma," he drawled, his voice loud enough for every guest to hear, "remind me again what you actually do for this family, besides looking pretty." Laughter rippled across the table. Margaret, his mother, smirked behind her pearls. Daniel, his younger brother, added, "She's our family's charity case, isn't she?" Emma's fingers tightened around her glass, but her expression never changed. Her silence was unsettling. It made people uncomfortable. Richard stood up abruptly, walking over to her. The room quieted. His shadow loomed across the white linen and gold-rimmed plates. Then, without warning, he spat in her face. The sound echoed, a wet, cruel slap. Gasps filled the room. Someone dropped a fork. Emma froze, the humiliation burning through her skin. Richard sneered. "Worthless," he hissed. "You don't belong at this table." For a moment, no one moved, not even Emma. Then she calmly took her napkin, wiped her face, and looked straight into his eyes, not with tears, not with anger, but with something far more dangerous: resolve. "Enjoy your dinner," she said softly. Her tone was ice, her poise unbreakable. Margaret whispered to her neighbor, "See, she can't even stand up for herself." But they were wrong. Emma was standing taller than ever, inside. As Richard laughed, raising his glass, thinking he had won, Emma's mind whispered one truth that kept her breathing steady. They don't know who they're laughing at yet. The music swelled again, the night carried on, and no one saw the storm quietly forming behind her calm, dark eyes. The dinner dragged on like a silent punishment. The laughter had died, replaced by an uncomfortable tension no one dared name. Yet Margaret Dawson, Richard's mother, seemed completely at ease. She dabbed the corner of her lips with a napkin and said, "In my day, men didn't have to tolerate women who forgot their place." Daniel chuckled under his breath. "She should be grateful we let her sit here." Emma stayed still, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't give them what they wanted. No tears, no rage, no proof that they'd broken her. Her silence wrapped around the room like a storm cloud waiting to burst. Claire, sitting beside her, leaned in and whispered, "I'm so sorry, Emma. He shouldn't have done that." Her tone trembled with sympathy, but her eyes, those green eyes, flickered with something else. Admiration? Envy? It was hard to tell. Richard lifted his glass again, grinning. "Let's toast to honesty, to the truth about what's real in this family." Margaret clinked her glass to his. "To truth," she echoed, her smile sharp as glass. Emma slowly reached for her own wine, raised it high, and said softly, "To family." The words hung in the air like smoke. Her tone wasn't soft, it was surgical. A toast not to unity, but to hypocrisy. For a brief moment, everyone froze. Even Richard's grin faltered. Then he scoffed, waving her off as if she were a child throwing a tantrum. When dinner finally ended, the guests drifted out with murmured goodbyes and awkward smiles, pretending they hadn't just witnessed a man humiliate his wife. Claire lingered behind, her hand brushing Emma's shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Emma. He shouldn't have done that." Her tone trembled with sympathy, but her eyes, those green eyes, flickered with something else. Admiration? Envy? It was hard to tell. As the last car left the driveway, Emma stood alone in the empty dining hall. Crystal glasses still gleamed, laughter still echoed faintly, ghosts of a dinner that would soon haunt every person at that table. She looked at the head seat, Richard's seat, and whispered under her breath, "One day, you'll choke on your own pride." Then she turned off the chandelier, plunging the room into silence. The mansion was quiet now, the kind of silence that hums after a storm. From the dining hall, Emma walked through the long marble corridor, her heels clicking like distant thunder, until she reached a smaller door tucked at the end of the west wing. Inside was her sanctuary. No gold, no portraits, no chandeliers, just a wooden desk, a flickering lamp, a few books, and the faint scent of lavender. It was the only room in the Dotson estate that felt like hers. She sat down, removing her earrings, letting out a breath she'd been holding since dinner. The mirror in front of her reflected a face that refused to break. The faint mark of Richard's spit still lingered on her cheek, but her eyes burned with quiet fire. Her gaze shifted to the photo on her desk, their wedding day. Richard in a white tuxedo, smiling for the cameras, his arm around her waist like a man proud of his trophy. She remembered that day vividly, not the vows, but her mother's whisper. "Smile wide, dear. At least now the press will think our family's progressive." Emma picked up the photo and let out a bitter laugh. 2 years ago, she had walked into his office to surprise him on his birthday, only to find him pressed against his secretary, Vanessa, on that same desk. He didn't even flinch when she saw, just looked at her and said, "You should have knocked." Later that night, Margaret came to her room, eyes cold as winter. She said, "Men like Richard have needs. Be grateful you have his last name." Emma hadn't cried that night. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. But she remembered how her hands shook as she held her late father's ring, a reminder of who she once was before she became Mrs. Dotson. A soft knock broke her thoughts. Claire stepped in holding 2 cups of tea. "You shouldn't stay alone after what happened," she said gently. Emma nodded, gesturing for her to sit. Claire placed the tea down and brushed Emma's hand in comfort, a gesture that lingered a little too long. "You don't deserve this," she whispered. "He doesn't see what he's losing." But behind Claire's calm smile, her mind was somewhere else. The image of Richard, powerful, confident, untouchable, flickered in her imagination. She hated him, yet envied the way he commanded the room. Emma didn't notice. Her thoughts were miles away, in the life she gave up, the love she never truly received, and the strength she'd have to summon to survive this cage of luxury. When Claire finally left, Emma looked out the window to the garden where laughter once filled summer nights. The wind rustled the roses. Somewhere in the darkness, she whispered to herself, "They think I'm broken, but I'm rebuilding." And for the first time that night, she smiled. Not from joy, but from awakening. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the manicured gardens of the Dawson estate. But inside, the house felt colder than ever. From the balcony, Emma watched Richard stride toward the tennis court, phone pressed to his ear, voice dripping with arrogance. "Yeah, the board still thinks I saved the company. She's just a formality now. Trust me, once the divorce is finalized, everything will be mine," he said, laughing softly. Emma turned away before he could see her. Her jaw clenched, her heartbeat steady, not from shock, but from confirmation. She had known this moment would come. Meanwhile, Claire stood near the fountain, waiting. Richard approached her, his cologne heavy in the air. "You've been loyal," he said smoothly, sliding a hand into his pocket. "Loyalty deserves reward." Claire's eyes darted nervously. "Richard, I'm your wife's friend." He smirked. "Emma's not my wife anymore. Not really. You're not like her. You understand ambition." For a moment, Claire froze, torn between guilt and fascination. Then she leaned in just a little too close, and that was all he needed. His words became a web, and she too got caught in it. From her study upstairs, Emma saw everything, every gesture, every betrayal. She didn't cry, she simply walked to her desk, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out a small black key. Inside the hidden compartment of her safe were documents, crisp, official, sealed in blue. Dawson Enterprises, ownership transfer agreement. Her name signed in clean, confident ink. Emma Louise Dawson, 90% shareholder. 2 years ago, when the company faced collapse, Richard had begged for investors. None came. Emma had stepped in silently, funneling her inheritance under an anonymous trust to save his empire. And then she'd watched him take the credit. She traced her name on the document with her fingertip, remembering her father's voice. "Never argue with fools. Just own the ground they stand on." Her lips curved into a faint, dangerous smile. She opened her laptop, scanning financial records, watching the numbers move like chess pieces. Every transaction told the same story. Her story. Then, her phone buzzed. A message from Claire. "Can we talk? I need to tell you something about Richard." Emma stared at the screen, her eyes darkening. "Of course you do." She typed back, "Sure, come tonight." As she closed the safe, her reflection stared back at her, poised, unbreakable, no longer the woman who'd been spat on. The mask of patience had cracked. Underneath it was something new, power, waiting for its moment to be seen. Downstairs, Richard and Claire laughed softly in the garden, unaware that the woman they thought they'd destroyed was the one holding the detonator. The ballroom of the Charlotte Grand Hotel glittered like a palace that night. Crystal chandeliers bathed the crowd in gold, violins played softly, and photographers swarmed around the red carpet. The Dawson Enterprises Annual Gala, a night to celebrate success, legacy, and leadership. Richard stood at the center of it all, wrapped in attention, his tuxedo crisp, his smile polished. Vanessa, the same secretary he once cheated with, clung to his arm like a badge of victory. "Mr. Dawson, what's the secret behind your company's incredible rebound?" a reporter asked, flashing cameras, blinding him in light. Richard chuckled, oozing confidence. "Vision," he said, "leadership, and knowing when to cut. Unnecessary weight." The crowd laughed politely. Emma stood near the back, her black gown simple but commanding, like midnight against marble. Every word he said dug at her pride, but she didn't flinch. She sipped her champagne, eyes sharp, calculating. From across the room, Claire watched her nervously. She had barely spoken to Emma since that message last night. Every time Richard brushed his hand against her back, she felt a sting of guilt and desire. Richard raised his glass on stage. "To new beginnings," he declared, "to expansion, to Dawson Enterprises leading the future." Applause thundered through the hall, cameras flashed. But from the corner, Emma's quiet voice sliced through the noise. "Funny," she murmured to the woman beside her. "He's toasting to a future he doesn't even own." Her companion blinked. "What do you mean?" Emma smiled faintly, the kind that hides a secret sharp enough to draw blood. "You'll see soon enough." Later that night, as the speeches ended and the crowd mingled over champagne towers, Emma slipped into the side conference room where the next morning's board meeting would take place. She placed a single folder on the table, her ownership documents, and locked the door behind her. The sound of laughter from the ballroom echoed faintly through the walls. Richard's voice boomed, charming investors, charming enemies, charming the very people who'd one day turn on him. Emma stood alone in the dark, hand resting on the documents that would soon rewrite his empire. "Let him have tonight," she whispered to herself. "Tomorrow belongs to me." Outside, through the glass doors, she could see Richard and Claire slow dancing. Claire's smile faltered for a half-second when her eyes met Emma's across the room, a look that says, "She knows." Emma simply turned away, collected her purse, and left the ballroom quietly. No one noticed her go, not yet. But by the next sunset, the world would know her name. The morning after the gala, the Dawson mansion felt eerily quiet. The party's laughter had evaporated, leaving only echoes of deceit. Richard's tuxedo still hung over a chair, the faint smell of perfume that wasn't Emma's clinging to the air. Emma sat at her desk, a cup of untouched coffee growing cold beside her. The previous night's images looped in her mind: Richard holding Vanessa, Claire's uneasy smile, the applause that celebrated a lie. She turned on her laptop. Dozens of unread emails blinked back, messages from lawyers, board members, financial advisors, all unknowingly serving a woman they thought invisible. Her phone buzzed again, this time a recording file from her private investigator. She clicked play. Richard's voice filled the room. "She's just dead weight now. Once the papers are ready, I'll be free. Claire can handle things until Vanessa's promotion is official." Claire's voice followed, soft and hesitant. "Are you sure you can just cut her out?" "She's been quiet lately." "Exactly. That's what women like her do. They disappear." Emma pressed pause. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she calmly took off her wedding ring and placed it on the desk beside her father's ring. One symbolized love built on deceit, the other integrity born from struggle. The decision crystallized. She walked to the fireplace, grabbed the framed wedding photo, and tossed it into the flames. The glass cracked as it burned, and for the first time in years, Emma exhaled, a sound halfway between grief and rebirth. Later that afternoon, she met her attorney, Mr. Thompson, in a private office downtown. He was one of the few who knew the truth. "You're sure about this?" he asked. Emma nodded. "I've stayed quiet long enough. It's time to remind them who's really in charge." He slid a document across the table. "These papers will transfer all operational authority to you once they're signed, but you'll need to present them to the board officially." "I intend to," she said. Her tone was calm, but her eyes were steel. That night, Richard came home drunk from another meeting. Claire's perfume lingered on his jacket. He smirked when he saw Emma at the dining table. "Still playing house?" he sneered. "You should start packing. I'll be filing for divorce next week." Emma smiled faintly. "Then I'll make sure to have everything ready." He scoffed and stumbled upstairs,
unaware that the woman sitting in his shadow had already taken away everything he owned, piece by piece, signature by signature. After he disappeared, Emma opened her laptop and sent the single email to the board secretary. Subject: Urgent Ownership and Leadership Review. Meeting requested. Tomorrow, 9 a.m. She leaned back, feeling the weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time, her silence wasn't a shield, it was a weapon. Down the hall, Richard laughed drunkenly. Upstairs, Claire's phone buzzed with his name. And in the study below, Emma smiled at the storm she was about to unleash. They wanted her gone. They were about to find out what gone really meant.
The next morning, the conference room on the 54th floor of Dawson Enterprises was filled with murmurs. The board members shuffled papers, adjusted ties, whispered predictions about another one of Richard's bold expansion plans. None of them knew the real storm that was coming. At exactly 9 a.m., the glass doors slid open. Richard entered first, confidence dripping from every step. Claire followed a few paces behind, her face pale but determined to appear composed. Cameras from the company's PR team clicked as the CEO strode to his seat. Then, without fanfare, Emma walked in. Her presence was quiet, but it silenced the room. She wore a charcoal gray suit, minimal makeup, and the calm of someone who already knew the ending of this story. "Mrs. Dawson," one of the older board members stammered, standing up. "We weren't expecting—" Emma interrupted softly. "I know." She took the seat opposite Richard, sliding a slim folder onto the table. Richard chuckled. "Emma, this is a closed meeting. Investors only." "Good. Then I'm exactly where I need to be." He smirked, leaning back. "This is a waste of time. Gentlemen, as I was saying—" "Sit down, Richard." Her tone was calm, but carried the weight of finality. Even the cameras froze. He blinked. "Excuse me?" Emma opened the folder. "As of last quarter, I've quietly reacquired every share my father's trust once held, the same trust you convinced the board to liquidate after his death. That gave me controlling interest in Dawson Enterprises." Gasps rippled across the table. One board member dropped his pen. Another whispered, "Impossible." Richard laughed sharply, his face turning red. "You're bluffing! Those shares were sold illegally." Emma's voice cut through his. "To your shell companies, all of which conveniently are now under federal review for fraud and tax evasion. You see, Richard, you left a trail even your lawyers couldn't hide." She tapped the folder, revealing signed documents, audit reports, and the private investigator's photos of him with Vanessa. "You built your empire on deceit, but you built it using my father's foundation. So when you tried to erase his name, you erased the one thing keeping you safe." Richard's jaw clenched. "You can't!" "I already did." The room fell into stunned silence. Emma turned toward the legal counsel seated beside her. Effective immediately, Richard Dawson is removed as CEO. As majority shareholder, I'll assume interim control. Claire looked at Richard, tears gathering in her eyes. "You told me she didn't matter," she whispered. Emma's gaze met hers. "He says that about every woman once he's done using her." Security stepped into the room quietly, as if summoned by invisible command. Richard stood, furious, shouting over the noise, "You'll regret this, Emma! You're destroying everything!" She stood too, calm and composed. "No, Richard, I'm rebuilding what you tried to destroy." As he was escorted out, the flash of cameras captured his last image, the once celebrated CEO, face twisted in rage, shouting as the doors closed behind him. The board sat frozen. Then, one by one, they turned to Emma. "What happens now?" one asked. She exhaled slowly. "Now?" She looked toward the skyline, sunlight breaking through the morning fog.
Now we build a company that remembers where it came from and who it betrayed to get here. She closed the folder and walked out, heels clicking against the marble, leaving behind the ruin of a man who thought he could silence her forever.
3 weeks after the boardroom coup, the once golden name Richard Dawson had turned into a whisper, the kind people said behind closed doors, not in headlines anymore. The news outlets called it the quiet revolution. Stock analysts called it a stunning corporate reclaim. But in the quiet of a small rented apartment far from the city skyline, Richard just called it ruin. His reflection stared back from the cracked bathroom mirror, unshaven, eyes bloodshot, wearing the same shirt for days. The phone buzzed endlessly with messages from reporters, lawyers, and debt collectors. He threw it against the wall. On the TV, Emma's face appeared during a live press conference. The new CEO of Dawson Enterprises, calm, confident, poised. The world called her the woman who rebuilt her father's legacy. Richard turned up the volume. "This company," Emma said, "was born from integrity. My father believed in fairness, in building something that lasts. That's what we're returning to. Not greed, not exploitation." Her tone was steady, but there was something behind it, a quiet sorrow that no one but her could hear. Claire watched too, sitting in her own apartment, guilt eating at her. Her phone had messages from Richard, from Vanessa, even from journalists wanting her side of the story. She deleted them all. When she saw Emma on screen, she whispered, "You did it. You actually did it." But Emma wasn't celebrating. At the office, after the cameras stopped flashing and the applause faded, she sat alone in her father's old chair. The city lights glittered below, thousands of lives moving on, unaware of the storm that had ended here. Her assistant knocked gently. "Ma'am, the press wants a follow-up statement about your ex-husband." She didn't look up. "Tell them I have no comment." "But they're asking if you plan to press charges." She paused, staring at the family photo she hadn't yet burned, Richard smiling beside her before the lies. "No," she said softly. "Let him live with what he's lost. That's punishment enough." The assistant nodded and left quietly. For a moment, silence filled the office. The sound of the city below was distant, unreal. Emma turned off the desk lamp and walked toward the window. The skyline stretched endlessly, the same view her father once admired. For years, she had dreamed of standing here, reclaiming what was hers. And now that she had, it felt hollow. She whispered to the glass, her reflection faint and tired. "I won, but why does it still feel like losing?" Outside, a storm rolled in. The thunder echoed through the glass towers, washing the city in cold light. Somewhere in that same storm, Richard wandered the streets, soaked, furious, broken. And as lightning flashed across the sky, two souls who once built an empire from love now stood in its ashes. One powerful, one destroyed, both haunted. It was late, nearly midnight, when the knock came. Emma had stayed at the office again, reviewing quarterly reports, though the words blurred on the page. The storm outside hadn't let up. Thunder rolled across the skyline like a restless ghost. She almost ignored the sound, but the knocking came again, softer this time, almost hesitant. When she opened the door, Claire stood there, drenched, pale, eyes red from crying. "Claire," Emma whispered, "what are you doing here?" Claire hesitated, clutching a soaked manila envelope. "I didn't know where else to go." Emma motioned her inside. The smell of rain filled the room as Claire stepped in, dripping onto the marble floor. They stood in silence for a long moment, two women who once shared everything, now separated by betrayal. Finally, Claire spoke. "He's gone, Emma. Richard. I think he's lost it." He called me tonight, said he's going to destroy everything. You, the company, himself." Emma didn't flinch. "He's been saying that for years." Claire shook her head. "No, this time it's different. He found out about your father's hidden account, the trust that funded your rescue of Dawson Enterprises. He's threatening to leak it, twist it into something illegal. He thinks if he ruins your reputation, he wins." Emma closed her eyes. She had expected this, the final blow from a man who couldn't bear defeat. But the way Claire's voice trembled told her there was more. "I helped him," Claire whispered. "At first, I gave him documents. I thought he'd just scare you. I didn't know he'd go this far." Emma turned slowly. "You what?" Claire's tears spilled. "I was angry, jealous. You had everything. The grace, the power, the silence. He made me believe you didn't deserve it. But when he fell, I realized he never loved anyone, not even himself." Emma walked to the window, the storm flickering behind her. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she spoke, quietly, but each word sharp as glass. "You know what hurts the most, Claire. Not his betrayal. I expected that. It's yours." Claire sank to her knees. "I'll fix it. I'll testify. I'll tell the board the truth. Just, please, don't hate me." Emma looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, she didn't see a rival. She saw a reflection of her own brokenness. "Get up," Emma said finally. "We can't change what's been done, but we can stop what's next." Claire blinked. "You'll help me?" "No," Emma said, turning away. "We'll help each other." Hours later, the two women drove through the rain to Richard's apartment. The door was ajar. Inside, the place was a mess. Broken glass, scattered papers, whiskey everywhere. The television played a news segment about Emma's leadership. Richard sat on the floor, staring blankly at the screen, muttering to himself. When Emma stepped forward, he looked up, dazed. "So, the Queen visits her fallen knight," he slurred. "Come to watch the end." Emma didn't answer. She simply laid the envelope on the coffee table. Inside were the original trust papers, proving everything was legal, transparent, and ethical. "This was never about money, Richard," she said softly. "It was about respect, something you'll never understand." He laughed bitterly. "Respect doesn't buy love." "No," Emma replied, "but losing it destroys everything." As she turned to leave, Claire followed. Richard called after them, not in anger this time, but in defeat. "Richard," he said quietly, "you always win, don't you?" She stopped at the door. "No, Richard. I just stopped letting you define what losing means." The thunder cracked again, swallowing the silence. A month later, the storm clouds over Charlotte finally broke. The air smelled like renewal, clean, sharp, and alive. Emma sat at a cafe she used to visit in her early days, back when she was just another quiet face in the crowd. She wore no makeup, no designer suit, just a cream sweater and jeans. For the first time in years, no one stared at her. No one whispered her name. Across the street, a billboard still displayed the old Dawson Enterprises logo, the same one she'd rebuilt from ashes. She smiled faintly, then turned away. Claire joined her, 2 steaming mugs in hand. Black coffee, just like you like it. Emma accepted it with a nod. "You're learning." Claire chuckled softly. "Still can't believe you let me come back." Emma looked at her. "You didn't ask for forgiveness. You earned it." They sat in silence for a while, watching the morning unfold, joggers passing, children laughing, sunlight
piercing through the fading mist. Then Claire said quietly, "Do you ever miss him?" Emma didn't answer immediately. She stared at her reflection in the coffee, calm, steady, unfamiliar in its peace. "I miss the idea of who he could have been. But the man he was, no. I stopped missing him the day I realized silence was stronger than shouting." Claire nodded, eyes glistening. "You're stronger than anyone I've ever met." Emma smiled, not proudly, but peacefully. "No. I just finally remembered who I was before they told me who to be." A few tables away, a young couple laughed together, oblivious to the two women who'd lived through betrayal, power, and redemption. Emma took a deep breath, letting the sound wash over her. The phone buzzed once, an email from the board. New partnership approved. Project Phoenix launched. She smiled at the name. Fitting. As Claire reached for her purse, Emma stopped her. "No rush. Let's just sit a little longer." The camera would have pulled back here, the city bathed in gold, the scars of the past softening into something almost beautiful. Emma turned her face toward the sunlight. She didn't need an audience anymore. She didn't need revenge. She had something far rarer: peace. And in that quiet, her silence spoke louder than every insult, every betrayal, every cruel word ever thrown her way. It spoke of survival, of power reclaimed, of a woman who refused to be defined by the hate of others. As the scene faded, her final words lingered like a soft echo. They thought silence was weakness, but silence was my revolution.